Hi everyone, thanks so much for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. Before we bring on tonight's guest, if you've had a Dogman encounter and would like to speak with me about it, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. If you've had a Sasquatch sighting and would like to be a guest on Bigfoot Eyewitness Radio, please go to bigfooteyewitness.com and submit a report. All right, let's bring on tonight's guest. Tonight's guest is James. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. James, please give us a brief bio on yourself.
Well, I'm 42, soon to be 43. I work in the security guard industry as a security guard for a facility in the city that I live in. I enjoy online gaming and I enjoy reading. As far as getting out, I do get out and I enjoy, there's a Renaissance festival that takes place here once a year and I try to go as often as possible. It's always so much fun seeing the people dressed up in the very lively and colorful costumes. I even got my picture taken with a gentleman who was dressed up as Captain Jack Sparrow from the Pirates of the Caribbean, which was absolutely hilarious because the constables at the fair put me in stocks for associating with known criminals.
Sounds like a good time. Your encounter happened 30 years ago, James. How much healing have you done in that time?
Well, they say time heals all wounds. And when this initially happened, and even through my teenage years, I wasn't sure I'd ever heal from this. But looking back at the incident now, 30 years later, I have to say that saying is very true, and it applies to more than just losing somebody, that it applies to all severe traumas. It's not an easy process, and it's certainly not a quick one, but it does work. I remember after the incident happened, and even into my teenage years and early 20s, I would still have very vivid nightmares of the incident that happened, that shook my beliefs, what I believed as a child, and shaped what I believed as a teenager going into adulthood, because as a child growing up, I'd always been told by my mother and by other adults that these things, these monsters, these dogmen and other creatures of the night like them, such as vampires and ghosts, they didn't really exist, or there was some sort of scientific, logical explanation for them, but they weren't real and they couldn't hurt you. And then at such a young age to find out that everything your parents and every adult who you've ever had contact with has told you is not true, and that they don't know it's not true, that these things do exist. There are things out there that are beyond comprehension, that your conscious mind just cannot wrap itself around because of what science says is reality versus what you're looking at. And suddenly it just changes your perception of reality, your perception of the world around you, and that stays with you. Shapes who you become, and it shapes who you are as an adult, and even further down the road as you get older.
Oh, sure it stays with you. I'm really impressed that you're handling this so well after having such a traumatic experience at such a young age. You had your encounter while you and your mother were house sitting for friends of hers. Had you been to that property before you had your encounter there?
No, actually we hadn't. My mother was in between jobs at the time, and this offer of house sitting seemed like the perfect solution to our living arrangements until my mom could find work. So my mother gratefully accepted, and we moved up there without a second thought. We didn't have any reason why we shouldn't. So we did, and for the most part, most of my memories of that time that we spent there, with the exception of the encounter I had, were relatively fond ones. I mean, what boy doesn't like camping out and being able to go hunting for small game or being able to play in the woods at that point in their life? And I did. I really enjoyed it. And then I had my encounter, and that just changed things drastically for me.
Yeah, that really is a shame. Any kid, any adult for that matter, should be able to head out into the woods without a care, for the most part. But yeah, when you have an encounter with something like what you encountered that night, yeah, that changes all that without a doubt. Before you tell us about your encounter, what can you tell us about the property itself?
Well, the property we were looking after, our friend's property, was situated right off of the only main road that went through that particular town at that time. It was very heavily forested, and there was a clearing just large enough right off the road for a driveway. And to the right of the driveway, you had a small 2-story house that had a kitchen area with a wood-burning stove, and they had their own well dug on the property. And the only concession they made to being attached to the nearby city, as far as utilities went, was electricity. As far as gas went, everything was heated by the wood stove. They had an outhouse, which was not necessarily always the most pleasant experience for obvious reasons. They had a number of dogs, and I always got along with animals. Loved their dogs. They weren't too big, but they weren't too small, and they always liked playing with them. So I got along really well with their dogs. They kept them in kind of a fenced-in area off to the left side of the driveway, and the fence went right up to this rather small pond they had right in the same general area. To get from the house to the pond or the fenced-in area where the dogs were kept, you'd go across the driveway, and then you have to come up a little bit of a rise because the erosion, rainwater, whatnot had kind of rutted out the driveway. It was strictly dirt. But you come up a little bit of a rise, and you could go into the fenced-in area, or you could go over to the pond. I would never recommended swimming in the pond because you couldn't see the bottom of the pond. It was kind of a dark brown color, and I wasn't sure what made it that color, and I was pretty sure I didn't want to find out what made it particular lovely shade of brown. I do remember that the fenced-in area, it extended out from, they did that to keep dogs from running out into the main road. So it was more for their safety than it was a fear of them being vicious attack dogs. They were anything but. I do remember the forest. It encircled the area that was open for the house, the pond, and that. On all sides, it was well within 10 to 15 yards. And once you got that far away in any direction from the house or the pond, it was just very dense and heavily forested woods. And for the most part, even on a good day, you couldn't see more than 4 or 5 feet at most into the woods if you're standing on the edge. There was no clear line of sight anywhere for very far on the property.
It sounds like it was a nice place. It's just too bad the Dogman ruined your time there.
Yes, it was a very lovely place. Very idyllic for if you wanted to actually feel like you're completely away from everything, the city, the property you're on. You didn't have to go more than 20, 30 yards in any one direction, and you're completely surrounded by woods and the sounds of nature, all the different bird calls and insects. And that was the other thing that always was so reassuring was I knew from watching National Geographic and books that I read that whenever those sounds are present, then you're perfectly safe. The only time that a person has to worry about being in the woods is when the woods go completely silent, because the only time that happens is when there's a large predator that is recognized by the local fauna, the local animals, as a predator. Then they go quiet as a defensive mechanism to keep from being found by the predator. So I had that in the back of my mind, and a lot of other information that I had picked up from reading and watching various TV programs that had been broadcast on VHF and UHF channels over the course of my short life at that point. I do remember how we'd been house sitting for 2, maybe 3 weeks at this point. So they made sure we had all the basic information. They made sure we knew how to contact local law enforcement or first responders if we needed them up there at the cabin before they left. They told us, well, there's always a possibility you might run into like a small black bear or a bobcat, with the area being so heavily forested that there were deer and there's plenty of game for a forest predator to actually hunt. So they wanted to make sure we were aware of any possible danger. They said the dogs were not going to be much protection against something like that, but they would alert us if something like that came close to the property, to just keep an ear open for them acting in a way that isn't normal. So with that, they said their farewells and they headed out. We settled in, and for 2 to 3 weeks, I was slowly getting to know some of the nearby children, which they weren't nearby in the way you might think if you lived in the city. The nearest child that I got to know that I could call my friend, who was close to me in age, was about a mile down the road. And I would usually go down there to visit with him, and he had all the latest toys and the cool stuff that I liked. And he was always very generous, a very kind person, which is, I guess, what attracted me to him and started a friendship.
Well, he does sound like he was a really good friend to have. All right, James, it's time to talk about your encounter. I know it's still hard for you to talk about, but please give us every last detail that comes to mind.
Okay. Well, as I said, our friends wanted to make sure we were aware of any potential dangers and that we could keep ourselves safe until the local authorities could come and take care of whatever problem cropped up. So in an effort to make sure of that, my friend's son, who was about 4 or 5 years older than me, took me out the day before they left and showed me how to use the 410 shotgun, which is not a very big shotgun. But he taught me how to shoot with it, how to maintain it, how to store it away safely so that it wouldn't pose a danger to me or my mom. He made sure we knew where the big flashlight was at in case we needed it for going outside at night. And I remember this night really well. It was trying to think, I want to say it was September, maybe, mid to late September, and fall and winter come earlier in that part of the country because of the mountains and the forests and everything than it does in just about anywhere else except for maybe the Northwest and the Northeast. So this was a particularly brisk evening, and the sun had set. The dogs were put out in their fenced-in area, as they always were, and they were never really happy about being fenced in out there. They'd much rather be inside the house, but they were just too rambunctious and rowdy to be allowed in the house. They'd just destroy too much. So they all had their dog houses, and they were all lined with hay or straw or something that they could use to keep themselves warm. Usually once they were put out in the fenced-in area, especially with it getting colder, they'd settle down relatively quick, 10, 15 minutes at most. And then you wouldn't hear a peep out of them unless something that wasn't supposed to be on the property, a person or a wild animal, got too close to their enclosure. And then they'd just go nuts. So this particular evening, my mom was fixing dinner on the wood stove, which that's a very interesting experience in and of itself, watching her cook and then the quality of the food that comes off of something like that. Anyway, we had been hearing the dogs. They'd been in their fenced-in area for about a half hour, 45 minutes since the sun went down. And initially they did quiet down. But then as my mom started fixing dinner, they started up. They all were going crazy, barking at something. And we let it go on for 10 or 15 minutes, thinking maybe it was just a resurgence of they wanted to come in and we couldn't let them come in. But after 20, 25 minutes of this, of them carrying on, my mom asked me if I would go out and take the shotgun with me and as well as the flashlight and see what was driving them so crazy. So I was somewhat reluctant to go out in the cold, but my mom asked me and I did for the most part what my mom asked me to do, just try and help out. So I took and I put on a lightweight jacket. I grabbed the shotgun, I grabbed the flashlight, and I went out the side door by the kitchen. Walked up to the fence in the area. I opened the gate that led in. I closed it behind me so the dogs wouldn't come running back, wouldn't come charging at me and get by me and then go charging at the door. That would have been horribly irresponsible of me. So I continued on my way up to where they were at. And I noticed, I was shining my flashlight ahead of me and I got where I could see them. And I noticed about 4 or 5 yards before I got to them that they were all pointing at the exact same point in the woods. And they were going ballistic at this point. They absolutely refused to stop, even though I tried to calm them down. At which point I thought, okay, there's something out there, and it might be a raccoon, but based on what my friends had told me, it could be anything from a raccoon all the way up to a small black bear. So I really didn't have any kind of desire to have an encounter with something even as big as a black bear. So I was trying to get a good look at what they were barking at, and I started shining my flashlight kind of back and forth in the area. And I just caught the side profile of, at first I thought it was a large dog, and the longer I looked at it in the light of my flashlight, I realized it's not a dog. That's a wolf. I mean, I'd seen enough wolf on nature documentaries to know the difference between a wolf's head and a dog's head. Only this one was, take the biggest wolf head you've ever seen in your entire life and double it in size. And that's close to what I was looking at that night. Now, at that point in my life, I was 3.5 to maybe 4 feet tall. So if you can imagine a head that large coming out from the side of a tree, and you get kind of the impression of where the shoulder joints would be at the front of the thing, and I realized very quickly this wolf was a monstrously sized wolf, because it was on all fours. It was at least 6 to 8, maybe more inches taller than I was, and this thing is on all fours. At which point it it's like it took this thing this long, and I'm sure this is not the case, but it seemed like it took it 5-10 seconds to notice that somebody was looking at it with a flashlight and saw it. And then it just kind of let out this gut-wrenching, kind of deep from the bottom, from the pit of your stomach, kind of growl / snarl. And it exposed its canines at the front of its muzzle, and these things were almost as long as my pinky finger and almost as big around. When it did that, the dogs all immediately shut up and began whimpering, and they all tucked their tails between their legs, because it dawned on them at the same moment that it dawned on me that what we were dealing with was something out of the ordinary. Something that we were dealing with what initially I thought was just a rather large wolf that had been alive for a very long time. Is the only thing I could think of, the only way I could think of it being that big. The only explanation that made sense to me at that time. I managed to get the dogs to start backing away from me, and I'm not sure it was me that caused them to start backing away, or they just started doing it on their own. But as soon as I saw them starting to take steps backwards away from this thing, I decided they're not going to protect me from this thing. The best I can hope for is that they'll slow it down long enough for me to get back to the house if it decides to charge us. Then, as it started to approach us, this stench, the breeze picked up just for a moment and blew towards us from this thing, and the stench that assaulted my nose was unlike anything I've ever smelled before or since. I'm not sure I can accurately describe it, but it was a combination of urine, feces, and something else I don't even have a word for, but it was a combination of 2 or 3 different odors, and it just reeked of them. And it was those odors combined with what I was looking at that just really started to cause my base instincts, my fight or flight response, to start becoming overwhelming. And the only thing that kept me from just dropping the flashlight, dropping the shotgun, and turning tail and running, because I knew, as big as this thing is, that 410 shotgun wasn't going to do anything but make it mad. And that was the last thing I wanted to do. But I was holding on tooth and nail to one thought, one piece of information that came to the forefront of my mind at possibly the one and only time I've ever really needed that particular piece of information. And that is, if you turn and run from a predator, they will chase you down and they will kill you. Then they'll drag you off somewhere, most likely, and eat your remains. Or they may just decide to eat you while you're still alive. The safest way to get away from a situation like that is to back away. So with every ounce willpower I could muster at this point, I backed away slowly. But as it came out from the wooded area and I got so I could see more of this thing, it didn't look right for a dog. I mean, it was still on all fours, but something about it was just not right, not normal for every other wolf I've ever seen. The front, what I thought at the time, the front paws were wrong. There wasn't enough hair on them. The abdomen area and across the back, behind the back of this thing, where the midsection of this thing, both the back and the front, didn't have anywhere near what I thought it should have as far as fur. It was like somebody with thin hair. And then you get down to the rear legs where the waist would be on a person just above the rear hips. And I could see that the fur got really thick all over again, all the way down to the paws. I happened to notice that some of the fur around the ankles seemed to be, I don't know, it looked kind of clumped up or matted in somehow. And then the thought came to mind that, some dogs will sit down and they will bend their head over because they don't have any other way of doing it, but they'll chew on wherever they've got an itch. And I'm thinking, okay, that may be what happened there. And it was one of those really off-the-wall, kind of things that, why am I worrying about what it did to scratch and itch? The thing's still coming at me. I could see the upper body from the shoulders all the way up the neck, and covering the entire head. The fur was thick and what you would expect to see on a wolf. And it had these, at least in the light of the flashlight, it had these evil, is the only way I can describe it, this malicious stare. And the eye color that I could make out with the flashlight, and the thing had was almost an amber gold, which part of me in the back of my mind thought, no creature that feels this evil should have such a nice color to their eye. It should be red or something. But it wasn't. And then I noticed I could kind of see the chest area. And I noticed it had, the chest on this thing was not like any wolf I'd ever seen. It reminded me of a human chest. And I'm slowly still backing away, and I'd covered about a third of the distance between the house and where I had initially run into this thing. And I knew there was no way, especially with that gate that I closed behind me, that I was going to make it out of this enclosure. If I decided to turn tail and run, the thing would catch me. So long as I kept backing away, I thought maybe it was mistaking me as another predator, or it was just backing me out of its territory, but that didn't feel quite right either, and I couldn't put my finger on it. And this just, my mind is still trying, and my conscious mind at this point was still trying to wrap itself around what the bits of information that I was getting. And then I took a quick glance over my shoulder, and I could see the gate was only a few feet behind me, and then the house was only just on the other side of the driveway. And I looked back, and this thing did something that I was not expecting. Something I was told animals like this, that no animal outside of a bear could do. And it wasn't that it stood up. It wasn't just something that it sprang up on its hind legs and did. No, it was like it had to force itself up by its front paws, just like somebody doing a push-up and then pushing themselves up off of the ground. And as it did this, I started hearing this sound. And at the time, I didn't recognize what it was. It was a few years and several movies and fights and things later before I realized what that sound was. It was like every bone, every joint in this thing's body was snapping and cracking and popping. It was just the most god-awful collection of sounds a body could make without actually vocalizing it. And when it was done, it was standing on its hind legs, and it went from being just 6 to 8 inches, a little more than that, taller than me to being more than double my height. And what I had thought were front paws were human-like arms attached to a humanoid or a human-like torso and abdomen. When it stood up on its hind legs, it just shattered everything I ever believed that every adult had ever told me about this. And that was, werewolves don't exist. Vampires don't exist. They're just things people made up to scare little kids. They're not real. And yet here I am, less than 24 yards from the house that I was staying in, with a flashlight pointing at what could only be a werewolf or what's become known as a Dogman. And it let out that growl again. It was almost like it was leering at me, daring me to do something that it would give it the excuse to just take a swipe at me or come charging at me. And I think I may have let myself at this point because my mind was running in a little circle between the idea of I'm looking at a Dogman and then the other part of my brain going, Dogmen, werewolves do not exist, can't exist, they're not real. And yet all of my senses are telling me this thing is real. It's standing right here in front of me. In the meantime, I managed to back up to the gate. It reached behind me, and by some miracle, I found a latch, and I opened it, and I pushed it back open, and let the dogs come with me, because I wasn't about to leave them at this thing's tender mercies to see what it would do to them. I was already terrified enough. My fight or flight instinct was my flight instinct will say there was no fight in just flight, sheer terror, the likes of which I've never experienced any other time in my entire life. Was really starting to become more and more overwhelming. And I got maybe halfway, 2/3 of the way across the driveway with this thing still walking towards me now on 2 legs instead of 4. My mind in just absolute utter shock, unable to form a coherent thought or put 2 words together in a sensible fashion, because my nightmare has become reality and I have no way of explaining this to anyone. At that point, when my conscious mind lost the ability to do anything but run in a circle, my instinct to run took over, and at which point the dogs followed suit. I ran for the kitchen door. Thank God I hadn't let it shut all the way, because I hit it with enough force I probably would have taken it off of its hinges trying to get in the house. Needless, that was not necessary. I do remember I hit it. I got through. I let the dogs in, and I remember looking back and saw that the thing was starting to pick up its pace and come straight at me. And I remember slamming the door shut behind me. My mom was irritated because I'd let the dogs in. She thought I'd let them in by accident, but that wasn't the case. And I'm sitting there, I'm trying to think of what can I tell my mom, fully expecting that monster to slam against the door or the side of the house at any moment. And I'm sitting here going, what can I tell my mom? She'll never believe what I saw. And my mom said, she asked me the logical question, which was, because she took a look at me and she saw the state I was in, and she asked me, what was up there? What did I see? And I decided to take the safest route that wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't necessarily a lie. And I told her I saw the biggest wolf I have ever seen in my entire life. And I could hear other the rest of the pack moving around in the woods, but I couldn't see them. And I didn't want to leave the dogs out there where a wolf pack could get to them. So she opened the door. She moved me out of the way, and she went to open the door, and all I could think, I turned around and tried to stop her, thinking, oh God, don't let her open the door because that thing's on the other side. Then she'll know I lied to her. She opened the door, and it was gone. And for years, I couldn't figure out why it had simply vanished. It had me dead to rights, could have killed me at any time, and that was another thought that was going through my mind while my conscious mind was going in circles. This thing's is toying with me, and it's going to kill and eat me at any moment, and it didn't. And for years, through my teens, into my 20s, anytime I would think about this particular incident, I could not fathom a reason why this thing didn't do what I thought predators were supposed to do. They find a prey item, they track it down, they hunt it down by whatever means is, whatever their MO is. Mountain lions hunt by stealth. Bears are more herbivores than anything. But this thing didn't do anything a normal predator does. And I had, God, probably a decade later, I was still having the occasional vivid nightmare that would wake me up out of a sound sleep. And then I'd have to sit there for a couple hours in the dark, running this over in my mind to get my mind to calm down, to understand that I was no longer 11, that this thing was not outside my door or my window, that I was safe because I was living in the city. I wasn't living outside the city. I wasn't even living in the suburbs. I was living in the downtown area of the city that I'd moved to, which was more than halfway across the country, and that I had nothing to be afraid of here other than maybe getting robbed or mugged on the street by a perfectly normal, ordinary human being. But trying to logically face this and trying to fight emotions as primal as what I experienced, sheer terror, the absolute, the knowledge that I had in that moment that my life was about to come to an end, and try and fight that with logic, and logic loses out almost every time. Now, it's been years since that happened to me, and as I said, time does have a healing effect. I quit having the vivid nightmares about this thing, and I have, to a certain extent, been able to come to terms with it really did happen to me. I didn't dream it up. It wasn't a figment of imagination. That it was real. It did happen to me. And that for some reason unknown to me, until recently, some reason I didn't understand, it didn't do anything I would have expected a predator to do. I was obviously the prey item. So were the dogs. It could have killed and maimed all of us, for all I know, without a second hesitation. But then I remember, as I think back to that moment, when it went from being on all fours to going to being upright and looking down at me, I remember thinking for just the briefest moment, this thing is leering at me as if he's just having fun, that he's toying with me, and he's deriving, this thing is deriving some sort of sick, sadistic pleasure from the fact that I am so terrified that I literally pissed myself. And then I pushed that away because I was still thinking of this thing as a predator, a monstrous predator, but still a predator with what a normal, with the instincts of a normal predator, the thoughts of a normal predator. And I think the fact that I viewed it as a normal predator was the only reason I was able to keep backing up and backing away from the thing rather than trying to run from it. If the thought that this is an actual monster, not a predator, with a monster with at least a human level, a human capacity for evil emotions, a human capacity for that level of thought, I probably would have turned and run, and there's no telling what would have happened to me if I'd done that. It might have still let me go, but it might have decided enough, it toyed with me enough and come after me. But since I've come to terms, more or less, with this incident, with this encounter, and I've been able to have a little more of an objective viewpoint of the details that I recall, I realized I wasn't dealing, I wasn't dealing with a normal apex predator. I was dealing with a monster, a true evil to the core of its being monster. And that brief thought of it's toying with me because it's getting some sort of sick pleasure out of my fear, that thought was the truth that I didn't want to face at the time. This thing wasn't just some animal. There was an intelligence in those eyes. And it knew just exactly how terrified I was. I mean, the physical signs were there. I mean, I'm sure I stank of fear. I was sweating. I wetted myself. And the dogs were no help. They were just whimpering and backing up along with me. And if they could have turned, if they could have gotten away from this thing and left me, they would have. But I was between them and the gate, and they were between me and it. And I think there were 4 or 5 souls, myself and all the dogs, who were never so happy to see the inside of the house as we were that night.
Talking about your encounter obviously isn't easy for you, James, but every time you talk about what happened to you that night, it's going to make dealing with it easier for you, so please don't lose sight of that.
No, I never do. I talk about it with people who won't look at me sideways like I've lost my mind or I'm making things up. I have found some solace in games like Dungeons and Dragons, which is a great game for, you can take any part of you, whether it's your fear or your courage, you can take your deepest, darkest fear and create something that you can beat up with some other part of your body, some other part of your being. You can create this vile, evil thing that you can beat up repeatedly. And it does help because it gives you a sense of control, returns something of a sense of control back over your life. It returns some level of sanity back to you. Although I have had a number of people who played that game with me wonder why my werewolves seem to be so accurate. And all I can do with them, knowing what they would think, all I could do is sit there and smile at them and tell them it's all comes from horror films.
Yeah, if anyone would have a good idea of what they would look like, yeah, it would definitely be you. When the Dogman growled at you, how close were you to the dogs at that point?
The initial growl, I was right behind them. I was actually trying to reach out and grab them by their collars to pull them back away from what they were barking at, because I had actually seen the head at this point. And I knew, at that point, I thought it was a large wolf. And I'm thinking, well, where there's one wolf, there's got to be others, because wolves are not solitary creatures. They run in a pack. And the last thing we needed was to have a wolf pack come out here and take off with these dogs, because the people who owned them really did love them and did treat them well as best they could. So when I saw that, I'm like, oh, I have to actually do something to get these dogs to back up, because they're too stupid to realize the kind of danger they're in. Then the blasted thing growled at us, and it was that growl, that deep, guttural, god-awful growl, combined with a snarl where it raised its upper lip and exposed its canines at us, that the dogs realized they had awakened something, or they'd gotten hold of something they didn't want any part of, at which point they went from barking to whimpering, with their tails tucked between their legs. One of the thoughts that has crossed my mind since then is, if I'd have had a tail at that point, I'd have probably tucked it between my legs and backed away all the quicker. But me and the dogs were both on the same sheet of music, back away from this thing and remove ourselves from the situation that we have gotten ourselves into.
Yeah, sounds like at that point the dogs realized they had bitten off more than they could chew. I'll tell you what, James, I've got a load of questions to still throw at you about that experience, but we're about out of time. Would you mind coming back next week for next week's show so I can ask you the rest of these questions and we can talk further about that experience?
Sure.
That's great to hear. Well, thanks again so much for your time, James, and yeah, I'll talk to you next week.
Talk to you then. Bye.
Bye. If you've had a Dogman encounter of your own and would like to speak with me, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you.